In this video, we're going to build this little listing component. It's not very fancy. We can enter text. We can, when we type it in and then hit enter, it will add it to the list below, as you can see here, and you can have multiple items here. This is going to give us a good excuse to talk about multiple actions and creating reducers, and another fairly simple but not quite as simple React and Redux application. So let's get started. We are starting, as we tend to do, with a basic create React app. Let's get this whole process started by installing, as we have been doing for the last several applications, installing Redux and react-redux. So as a reminder, now that even though we're 4 videos in, Redux is the state store. It's the thing that holds state. Where once you get started with React, you're going to get used to storing state within the components. Redux takes that state out of the components. So that's Redux. React-redux is glue between Redux and React. So we are ultimately using 3 things here. React on the one hand, Redux on the other, and React-redux in the middle to combine them. Alright, so we have it installed. Let's get this started again. And here's our code. And here's the back of the basic UI. I want to get rid of a lot of this boilerplate stuff, as we also tend to do. And let's go ahead and get a basic component on the screen. So our lister app is going to have an input and a list of things. And so let's create a component. And I'll just call it lister. For this, let's create a pure functional component. So first, let's go ahead and import React before we forget about it, because this will have to be here. And let's see, we're going to create a functional component. So function lister. This will take props, and we just need to return something. All right, let's see if we can import that and get it all to show up. Okay, let's see. You know what? I guess I actually have to wonder, since I've gotten rid of all my UI, why that isn't showing up there. And so I legitimately don't know. Oh, maybe because I have this warning. No, that's not going to be it. Let me stop this. Refresh. Not working. Start it again. Okay. Alright, so we're back with our blank. I didn't actually put lister in here. Now we should see it. Okay. Not sure why that got disconnected, but I solved it by just stopping it, restarting it, and now we're good to go. Okay, so we have our lister component. Like I said, we're going to need an input, and this is where we will type in our information, and when we hit enter, it'll add an item to the list, and then we're going to have an unordered list here with list items in it. Like so. Alright, so that's going to be the basic idea, at least in terms of what is created here. It's not beautiful, but idea will be we can type in something here, hit enter, and that text becomes an item. So now that we have the basic component done, let's start with our store. Let's get that built and talk about our default state, our initial state, and how we're going to structure this data. So I'm going to create a folder called store, and this is not a special folder name. A lot of people seem to call the folder they put this stuff in reducers. That's totally fine. I like calling it store. And I'm going to say index.js. Alright, so what do we need to do? Well, first of all, there is some initial state. So this is how we're going to start thinking about our state. What pieces of state is there to represent everything on the screen? Well, this title up here doesn't ever change, so that doesn't really need to be anything that's state-y. This changes, so that's like input text. So that needs to be part of our state. And then there's a list of items. So that needs to be part of our state as well. Like so. Okay, so an array of items. Right now this can be just strings. Later on we can upgrade it to something where you can delete the items or mark them as done, like if you're making a to-do list or something like that. Okay, so we have our initial state. We've modeled our state. Now let's go ahead and flesh out the pieces for finishing out the store. So we need to import from Redux create store. We're going to use this here in a second. Now, you create a store in Redux by calling create store and pass in a reducer. And so we need our reducer then. This is a function, and it takes state, which we will default to this initial state value, and it takes an action. And let me fix my syntax error right here. This is an arrow function, so I needed that. And so I'm going to console log here and say reducer, and then my action. So I can see everything that comes through here, and I will return the state. So this is a reasonable starter reducer. And so I need to create a store. Out of this reducer, there it is, and then export default store. So now we should be able to take this and use it. And in our case, let's go ahead and do this. Before we saw an error. So import store. If you start doing the react-redux stuff, and then you try to run the app before attaching the store, we got an error. So we've done that 3 times. I'll skip that this time by go ahead and getting this hooked up. It's good to see errors, and then so you can recognize them when you see them and fix them. This time we'll just skip it. So lister store, this is now being passed in. As it is right now, this is going to be of no real consequence. If we were to, console log the props here, in the render, here's our store. So we passed that in as a prop right here. So of course it shows up if we console log the props right here in the render. It will show up. We're not going to use it in that way, but it does make it there. Okay, so now that we've created the store and we've created a React component, if we want to make those two communicate in an ideal way, we will use, or at least if we want to use or leverage react-redux as a library to make them work well together, then we need a few things at this point. I want to import connect, and connect is a property to be imported, so we have to do it like that. So I'm going to import connect from react-redux. And then down here, we're going to stop exporting the default lister. We need a function called map state to props. This will return an object, and every key we return will be a key that we can use in this application. And so if we think through what is our state that this is going to need, well, in this case, it's going to need that input text. So, and in this case, the name is totally fine. And let's just start with that and get that input text flowing through. So map state to props, we will map dispatch to props in a moment. We don't need that yet. Export default connect map state to props, and then pass in lister. And so what this does is this creates a wrapper component around the lister. And so we're returning the wrapped component. We actually aren't returning our component anymore. We're returning a component wrapping our component that handles all that glue stuff, that stuff that connects React to Redux. And so it's handling all that stuff for us. So now in theory, we are running our app. The reducer is being run. That seems to be the case. It seems to be rendering, and the input text is coming in as props. This is coming in as props because we told it to come in as props. And so now I can go up here and I can say value equals props.input text. All right, so this should be bound to this value. Let's go to our state. Put something in there, okay? First of all, we can see that the text showed up there. Next, we can see that we got a warning. And this is a warning that we should expect, and it's totally cool. We have created a bound input with this input right here. And so what it's expecting is, and this is normal, if we have a bound input, you would generally expect there to be an onChange event. And we're going to get there, and that's what it's saying. Failed form prop type, you provided a value prop, and we did, without an onChange handler. This will render a read-only field. Yes. The field should be mutable, use default value, otherwise set either onChange or read-only. We don't need to do anything at this point. We're going to set the onChange here in a minute. But what we have proven is that if we change the text in the store on the initial value, that does flow down here to the list. All right, now let's go to the lister and let's do that onChange thing. So function map dispatch to props. So I'm going to say input change is going to be my function, or at least the key for the function, and we're going to pass the event object in here. And the reason why we're going to pass the event object is I need to get evt.target.value, and that is the value out of the input itself. Now let's think about our flux flow. If input is changing, that's the component changing right here. What I need to do is I need to create an action. I need to dispatch that action to the store, and the store will run through the reducer or reducers. In this case, we only have one. It'll run through the reducer, make any state changes, and if there are state changes, then the component will update. And so let's do this first piece, create an action. So const action equals, all actions have to have a type value of some sort. And so we're going to have in here a change text, change input text. I like that better. So change input text is going to be our action. Well, what are we changing in the store? What are we changing the text to? Because we're changing this. How do we know what to change it to? Well, we can't just send an action that says change input text because it doesn't have the actual text. So this is one of those cases where you're not only submitting an action, you're submitting some information with the action other than just the type. So in this particular case, we want to pass the text. And the text we can get from the actual input, like so. So evt.target.value. That's right here. Where does that event object come from? This is a fine question. Let's hook it up and have this discussion. So we've got this input change. We need to put that right here. We're going to say props.inputChange. So notice we're not passing any sort of event object right here, but yet we're expecting one to magically appear there. Well, this is actually going to magically appear there. If you've done any sort of just straight up JavaScript DOM programming, think back to the add event listener function that would be on DOM elements. Whenever an event would fire, let's say you set up a event for clicking, or a listener, you set up a listener for the click event on an item, and you clicked on that thing. What it would do is it would pass to your listener, the first argument would be an event object, and that event object would have information in it that you can use. Like, for example, what you clicked on. evt.target would be what you clicked on. Same thing with an input. If you've got like key up or key down, the input is changing, you could get the target by going evt.target, and then you go .value to get the value. And so in this case, we are giving it a listener. And so this is the input change. So whenever change happens, call this. And when it calls it, it's going to do something very similar. It's going to call it and pass this event object. Whether you like it to or not, it's going to pass the event object. If you get rid of the argument, it's still passing the event object. You're just ignoring it. But now we're not ignoring it because we put that parameter in there, and then we're going to use it right here. So the target is the input itself, and the value is how you get the value out of the target, or out of the input. So that's how that flow works. So now that I have my action, I can dispatch the action. So we've created the action right here. Now we're going to dispatch the action right there. And that's going to go to the store. Let's see that in action, assuming we did it all right. Oh, map state to props. You know what I forgot to do? I forgot to pass in map, but I don't want to pass this in. Let's see what's the net effect of not passing that in, so we can recognize this as an error. If we're looking here and we look at the warning here, we can see map dispatch to props is defined but never used. That should be a clue. We created map dispatch to props, but we forgot to put it in. Okay, well, another thing we can see is no sort of action seems to be triggered here. So if I were to go in here and say console log, let's see, change. Let's see what we see in this case. All right, so nothing. I'm changing the input. Nothing good is happening there. All right, so both of those things should be clues that maybe I didn't do anything with map dispatch to props. So here we go. Let's try it again. Okay, so it's still not changing here. We'll need to figure out why. This is expected. We need to figure out why, though. But we can at least see our changes happening. And also notice that the reducer is firing. The reducer, and this is the comment we put here, is the first line in the reducer. The reducer is getting run, and the action is coming through. It's just always one letter. And the reason why it's always just one letter is, let's take this scenario. I'm going to restart, and there's nothing in here. The state, the input text state is blank. So I'm going to type the letter A. So what happens is the letter A, if we go here, the letter A is in the input at this point. So we create an action with the letter A in the text. And we know that that's getting in there because when it gets to the reducer, there's that letter A. So we dispatch it. Then it gets to the reducer. We're not there. Now we're there. It gets to the reducer. Here's that console log. And then we return the state that has not been changed yet, where input text is a blank string. So that comes back, and here what happens is it essentially will re-render, but the state is blank, and so therefore it re-renders it as a blank right there. Because the state is never changing, the component re-renders. Or I guess chooses not to re-render, I guess, in this case, because no state change has been made. And so it's actually not calling this, but it is blanking out that input text for us, which is unfortunate because it's not working. So what that means is we need to handle this action. So if we look here in the lister, let's handle the action. Let's look at our type, and let's say switch action.type. So we're going to look at the action when it comes through, and we're going to say if it's change input text, what we want to do is we want to return a new state. Object.assign. We'll pass in a blank object and the current state, and now we will pass in any override we want to make. So in this case, we want to change input text to action.text if that was in fact the name of the property I put on my action. Let's go look. It is. It is the name of the property. So therefore, I'm going to change the input text to that. And I'm going to go ahead and do a default return state here and get rid of that. Okay, so now A, B, C, D, E, F, G. So we can now see it's happening. All right, cool. So we've got a full Redux data flow from the component to creating action, dispatching it, to running through the store, and then the component being updated for changing of the text. What we need to do now is we need to, whenever we hit enter in that input, we need to create a new item. So let's do that. You could look at the keys that are being typed to tell if someone's hitting the enter key or not. I think the somewhat easiest way of doing this, just slightly easy, would be to come in here and just wrap this in a form. And so we could say form, and then here, and say form, and depend on normal form submission for this to work. So if we have a form and we need to handle that form post or that form submission and then send an action, that means we need to map dispatch to props. And so we need a submit form or submit. Let's just call it submit. We are also going to need the event object in a minute. We'll talk about it when we get there. So here we go. We need a const action equals type. Add item is a reasonable name for this. And we can actually get away with just doing this. And the reason why we can do this without passing any data is the state already has the input text. So we don't need to pass it. We just need to tell it, hey, now it's time to take that input text and put it in the array. And so we can do that, and we could say dispatch the action like so. All right, now we can come in here and say on submit equals props.submit. Now I want a console log submitting. So here we go. Now we have to ask ourselves why, when I hit enter, the text is going away and the console is refreshing. That's what we need to answer. So why is that happening? Well, by default, whenever you hit enter, it is submitting the form and is doing a form essentially. Let's look at the network tab. Let's see what it can tell us that we're doing. And so let's see, preserve log. Okay, so I'm going to go in here and type something. Notice here's this WebSocket bit. I'm going to hit enter. What it's done is after that WebSocket bit, it got localhost, pulled down the bundle, you got this little info thing again, and so it's actually completely refreshing the page, which is not what we want. Now this is easy to handle, and you may already see this coming because this is a very common thing to do in React. And so whenever the form submits, it's going to call this, and it's because it's a DOM event, it's going to pass an event object. And we can use that event object to prevent default. And what preventing default in this case does is it prevents the default behavior of submitting the form and refreshing the page. So now, if we type in things, let's go back to the network tab. Now, if we type in things, let's do this. Now, that's not happening. I'm not refreshing the page. However, my submission is totally happening, as we can see from that. Okay, so this is now getting called without the form submitting. That's why we want prevent default. That's what it does. So now we're dispatching the action, and the reducer is getting that action, I think. Let's make sure. Okay, enter. We're going to add item, and oh, looks that that is showing up in the reducer. So we have successfully create the action and sent it, and it is going through the reducer, but we're not handling it in any way. So let's take add item, and let's go in here and say case add item return object.assign. We've got a blank object, we have the state, and what we need to do is we need to replace items with a new array with this new item. So we can say items, and we're going to take the previous items list and say state.items, and then concat the new item onto it. If this is our first one, that means we have a blank array and we're concatenating a single thing onto it. If we have 5 things already, that means we're concatenating a new one, and so making it 6. And so what are we actually concatenating? Well, we need the input text from the state. So state.inputText, like so. So our state.inputText, we're concatenating. This will actually create a new array, and so this will override the original array. I think that should work just fine. Let's go back to our lister. Now, right now, we are totally hard-coding these list items, which is not what we want to do. Let's start getting ready for that. And what do we call that thing? We called it items. So I will call it items here. And I want to get that from state. So state.items, which means we should be able to see that in the props. So if I put in let's see, a good thing to do would be to go to sleep, enter, add item, and the next time it renders, hey look, items now has is an array of one thing, and if we look in there, we can see it has go to sleep. So my input text did actually make it into that array. Now we might notice something, that the input text still says go to sleep. That's not normally what you want. So how do we solve that? Do we need to send another action? And the answer is no, we don't. We already have an action here that we essentially need to get rid of the state whenever this action occurs, not when another action occurs, whenever this action occurs, which means we can just come in and say input text is now going to be blank. So this will take the input text, put it in that array, and then blank that out. So let's try it. And so now when we hit enter and we did the add item, the input text gets blanked out, and the item array now has the value that we put in there. Excellent. That works great. So now that we have the data flowing through this, let's get rid of our hard-coded item list. So we have the items. Since this is an array, this is a perfect time for mapping. And so there's not a this. No, we need to go from props. So props.items.map. And so this is going to be a function that first thing will be the item itself. And if I want it, and I do, I'm going to use the index in the array for that item as my key. So I'm mapping through the array, going to get everything, and I'm going to return a list item for everything in there. The text will be item, and the key will be index. So let's try it. Go to sleep, enter. Hey, it showed up there. Cool. Eat breakfast tomorrow, obviously. Eat breakfast, okay, sweet. Before I eat breakfast, I want to dream sweet dreams of steak, because I like steak. And that's good enough for our list, because as we can see, this is all working. And so we've got our application. All right, so as a review, we've got 2 pieces of state and 2 separate actions. Right? That's totally cool. It's actually normal in an application to have lots of different actions. So in this case, change input text, add item, both different actions, both do different things to the state in here. And so all of those, whether it's changing the text, where you create an action, dispatch it, and then it runs through the reducer, or when you're telling it to add an item, you're creating an action, dispatching it, running it through the reducer. This is going to be the normal pattern for things. This is our normal life as react-redux developers. All right, so that's that application. In the next video, I'm actually going to take this and work on it, and I'm going to do a little refactoring, and I'm going to turn this into something that's basically more like a to-do app, where you can mark things as done or delete them. That's the next video.